Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Natural Horror November, where I'm hijacking the Anatomy of Fear and spending the entire month of November to talk about my favorite genre of horror, and hopefully yours too. Last time we talked about the truest natural horror films, and of course we only scratched the surface. In fact, there are 2 more episodes devoted to very specific types of true natural horror already in the can, but before we get to those 2, I felt I had to do the episode on mutants first. Because let's be honest, all you out there who say you don't really care for natural horror, I know you at least love a good mutant movie. And truthfully, if you actually counted up every natural horror film, the largest number of them is probably mutant horror. And that makes sense, right? If I asked you to name true natural horror films, you could probably name the big ones: Jaws, Arachnophobia, Cujo. But for every one of those, I'm sure you could name one about just big spider movies. And if it began to feel like there's way more of them than the former, you'd be right. Now, I'm not going to say I don't have a spreadsheet with over 200 natural horror movies and counting, and if I did, I'm not going to say that I haven't done all the work of sorting them by creature and subgenre and rated them all. Okay, maybe I have done that. I am a Virgo. I like lists. Don't judge me. Anyways, perhaps we should start with the obvious question. Does mutant horror really count? And if so, when do you draw the line? That's a very good question. The short answer is, of course mutant horror should count at least sometimes. That's because, putting my sciencey cap on, according to a well-known reality that is studied very closely by modern biologists, mutation is a thing. In fact, it is such an undisputed reality that it's believed to explain the evolution of literally all life as we know it. Sometimes nature makes mistakes, and those mistakes die quickly. But sometimes the mistakes make better sense, and the next thing we know, we have eyeballs, opposable thumbs, fidget spinners, and so on. So the biggest question for us to answer is, when has a film deviated too much from science that it no longer becomes a natural horror film? Well, I'll admit I really don't have a complete answer to this, and I'll tell you why. It's not plausibility, although that is part of it. In order for it to be a natural horror film, the feasibility of a premise actually being possible is certainly one of the most non-negotiable requirements. But when it comes to mutation, that's kind of tricky. No one really knows precisely how mutation works, and it's not the sort of thing that you could experiment with, not ethically anyway. So you could almost say that if there was a causal link that can or has worked, that would be enough. And the best example is seen in a film we'll talk about in a minute. So, if it's not merely plausibility, what is it? Well, requiring that it be a mutation of a known living thing would seem like a pretty important detail. It seems like a no-brainer to include a movie like Eight-Legged Freaks, because it's about spiders and not anything else. A movie like The Host, on the other hand, is not about a creature known to exist. It is mutation horror, for sure, but it would be hard to call it a natural horror film. It's not just the implausibility of it. I mean, we might as well just go with Aliens if that's the case. But mostly, it just doesn't feel like the horror is natural. Even though there's pretty heavy moralizing at the end of that film, linking Agent Orange to our own moral failings as a species, and drawing attention to our potential impacts on the environment with our meddling, it nevertheless feels like a creature feature. The thing could literally be anything. The fact that it doesn't look like anything specific, like a snake or a spider, is a much bigger reason to put it in a different class entirely. Perhaps I'm wrong to make that distinction, but this is how I'm choosing to look at the whole genre of natural horror. I'm willing to include a silly movie like Eight-Legged Freaks because at least there's the pretense that the creature was natural, and it plays off that fear that we already naturally have of creepy-crawly things. No need to invent an entirely new creature. That silliness brings me to the next point, and that's what I think of as 2 general approaches. There are the much more popular and widely known mutant films that are mostly driven by exploitation. Eight-Legged Freaks falls into that category. Some movies are really not that complicated. The only movie with a more obvious title than Eight-Legged Freaks is probably Big Ass Spider. A lot of these movies also have some kind of genetic modification, and that's a tricky one too. Generally, my rule is this. If the movie's about the creature created and not the person or people that made it, that's fine. If it's about the people that made it, then it falls into the category of mad scientist films, which are completely different. It's one thing to show the wrath of nature in the face of man's hubris, but it's another to explore the hubris of man by using the iconography of nature. See the difference? Okay, here's an example. Look at Monkey Shines. Now, right off the bat, Monkey Shines deviates from natural horror by introducing telepathy. but we'll leave that aside for a second. Having psychological connections with animals is not out of the ordinary in natural horror, but we'll put a pin in that for now. The problem with Monkey Shines, aside from being borderline unwatchable, is that the focus is on the quadriplegic artist, as well as, to an equal extent, the scientist, who has been injecting the monkey with human brain tissue. The narrative is kind of a mess, but the point is, there's nothing natural about this story whatsoever, other than the fact that it happens to have a monkey in it. Now, contrast this with Piranha, where a group of genetically modified piranha are set loose on unsuspecting tourists. It has more in common with a movie like Jaws, and in fact was believed to be a Jaws ripoff, as most nature run-amok films in the late 70s were accused of being, unfortunately. I'll talk more about this film in a moment, but the point I want to make now is that the government operation that created these fish are literally nowhere to be found in the film. It couldn't be less about these mad scientists. It brings up an interesting reality about us humans. We've been genetically altering our environment for a really long time, most especially with agriculture, and those actions have consequences on the environment. An interesting subplot of the Piranha story might have been the ecological devastation that would have occurred in addition to the bloodbath we all came to see. I believe that the best natural mutant horror exploits our fear that nature, ever the indifferent arbiter of cause and effect, might come back like a boomerang to smack us in the face. It's actually pretty scary to think that we might change things so much that we set something into motion that we cannot stop. Mutant horror plays on our fear of nature as an uncontrollable beast. It's not really interested in getting us to learn our lessons or explore the psychology of the mad scientist. It's only interested in the horrifying bloody result. And the bloodier and sillier it is, the more it's probably using that first approach of exploitation. The second approach is much more subtle, though. It's very much interested in never letting us forget that nature is just doing her work. It also has more of a substantial message, far and above the typical meddlesome man trope that is present in most of these other films. This will make much more sense when I talk about the mother of all natural mutant horror films later on. I want to get back to that exploitation approach, though. You're probably wondering why there are so many of these types of films. Well, it's not really that complicated. I think the biggest reason is that it's easier, from a writing standpoint. People are already down to watch your movie if it's called Big Ass Spider. That's just how that works. More specifically, though, think about how much harder it would be to make something like an ordinary-sized spider scary. I mean, a lot of people are terrified of spiders as it is, but unless your movie was a drama about a person that happens to have arachnophobia, it's just not going to be that interesting usually. The other alternative is to increase the number of spiders, like Kingdom of the Spiders, but taking up that kind of a story requires endless amounts of research, more elaborate planning during production, and countless other creative hurdles that just hurt the brain, I guess. So whatever it is, whether it's a spider, an ant, a wild boar, a shark, or what have you, just make it the biggest you can make it and people will watch it. Other times, the scientific explanation is sort of thrown in there as an afterthought. Like, oh yeah, didn't we see drums of toxic waste? Oh, that must be it. It's a shame because there is a rich history of tying natural horror films to the world of science in a very respectful way, and it really makes the films so much better when they do that. The best example of this type of natural horror film, though, which was also the first in a lot of ways, has got to be the 1954 classic Them.
I tell you, gentlemen, science has agreed that unless something is done and done quickly, man, as the dominant species of life on Earth, will be extinct within a year.
This film is one of the most important horror films in history, and it certainly paved the way for the natural horror genre to follow. Up to that point, creature features were more of the nature of fantasy. Frankenstein, Dracula, the Invisible Man, they all had their day. They also found monsters from the actual world of fantasy, like King Kong and whatever Jules Verne stories were in fashion. On the other side of the 50s, we got the new zombies of Night of the Living Dead, folk and religious horror, and so on. So right smack dab between those two eras of horror was the period most engulfed in what came to be called the Red Scare.
We may be witnesses to a biblical prophecy come true, and there shall be destruction and darkness come up in creation, and the beast shall reign over the earth.
Yes, the earth, the skies above and the seas below, infested by swarms of nightmare creatures, crueler, deadlier than the armored giants of prehistoric eras. Here is a wild, headlong flight into terror as the desert erupts with the grim battle for survival. Here is a fear-frenzied moment of suspense as mankind totters before a thing that multiplies faster than it can be killed. Here is a desperate plunge into the black depths of the earth, where human courage challenges the brute force, the slashing jaws, the poison fangs that guard the subterranean nest where the beast spawns its terrible progeny.
And Them was the best epitomizing of that moment. It was pretty much the first big bug movie, as they called it, and it spawned an entire genre of big creature movies. Now, most of the films to follow were not what you might call natural, but Them was a truly one-of-a-kind film from this period. Its tone was serious, its cinematography was breathtaking, and its top-notch special effects earned it an Academy Award. It's in the style of what Stanislavski might have called fantastic realism. The characters in the world of this film are not merely spectacles for us to watch, but real people with whom we empathize. Everyone in the film seems to be an expert of some kind or another. Some are experts at telling the news, some are experts at keeping the peace or calming the children or whatever they normally do. And that's because, as scary as these ants are, they are nothing that a unified nation cannot handle. When the ants are chased into the underground sewers, it's as if the entire nation is pulling for the quote-unquote experts to do what they do best, and they do. Everyone understood clearly what the ants really represent. Even the poster for the film depicted ants that have very clearly human eyes, which look pretty darn creepy if you ask me. It was as if the film wanted to be crystal clear that the Russians are the one singular threat of mankind. One even gets the impression that nuclear power is only a minor concern, much less an existential threat. But if the political and cultural milieu of the movie seems a bit backwards by today's standards, it's one of the best snapshots in time from that period. I have no idea how I might have felt about a film like this if I had seen it on the big screen as a child, like my father once did, and I would not try to judge people back then for their thinking. It was a very different time, and I would imagine a very scary time. It is unique in the natural horror genre in another respect. None of the nature's revenge tropes that were set by movies like Jaws had yet to be written. Whether it meant to or not, it's where all of our stories about some kind of environmental disaster creating unwanted abominations originated. This was a time when the dangers of nuclear energy were known, but with so many gaps in our understanding. Nuclear power is still scary to some people today. Also keep in mind that while many credit Godzilla with kickstarting the genre of kaiju movies in the same year, Them was released several months before Godzilla, yet it touched on many of the same themes. For 2 decades, mutations in horror appeared mostly this way, through gigantism. There were formulas to them that were occasionally broken by regional films. A notable example is 1959's The Killer Shrews. It's a story about oversized mutated shrews threatening the land, which turn out to have been part of a failed science experiment. It was filmed outside Dallas, Texas, making it what they referred to then as a regional film. The existence of regional cinema is always an interesting one, because we often take independent cinema for granted in those days. Regional cinema was literally the independent cinema of that time period, and so even though The Killer Shrews has terrible production quality and is very dated, and doesn't feature shrews at all, but rather dogs dressed up as costumes, it's still worth checking out if only for the novelty of the story surrounding it. These types of movies were the exception to the rule, though. In general, the sillier the better. That was the rule for a long time. But the genre was probably officially declared dead, though, with 1972's Night of the Lepus.
What happened? That night science made its greatest mistake. What unknown terror?
Now, don't get me wrong. I enjoy Night of the Lepus a lot. I miss the days when natural horror films featured real live animals and a movie that is willing to use old school special effects techniques like forced perspective to make small animals look huge. The filmmaker inside of me has to tip my cap.
That strikes from behind the shroud of night.
But as far as big creature features go, when you're finally making horror movies about giant bunny rabbits, maybe it's time to throw in the towel. I'm just saying. Most critics and audiences must have agreed because things started to shift. Filmmakers began to look at more creative ways to portray the terror of nature. The 1970s were the golden age for natural horror, as we've discussed, but it's interesting to see how mutation horror specifically evolved. Suddenly, all those big creature features had run their course, and audiences were ready for films that were darker and more adult. Somebody must have wanted to go back to the drawing board because Phase 4 was a step in a new direction that also features ants out in the desert.
In the next few moments, we will try to give you an impression of a new kind of film experience. If your curiosity is aroused, you are ready for Phase 4.
This is such a silly film that it has its own episode on Mystery Science Theater 3000, and its premise about a strange cosmic event that somehow imbues the ants of Earth with highly evolved intelligence falls apart rather quickly upon close review. If anything, Phase 4 greased the wheels for greater curiosity about nature's creatures and how exactly they behave. The ants in Phase 4 certainly look like ants, and I will say the best thing about this movie is how the ants themselves are photographed so beautifully. They may appear 50 feet tall on the movie screen, but this time they're just ants. But they're not acting like we expect ants to act. Once again, we can almost sense Hitchcock speaking to the 1970s and reminding us that you don't need to make it that complicated in order to scare the bejesus out of us. It would take a few years for that lesson to sink in. A lot of low-budget experiments took place that were pretty noteworthy for how they moved the ball forward in the genre. Squirm was a movie that was certainly not very serious or mature, but it was a step toward seeing what else can be done to make nature's creatures scary.
It was a violent summer storm. Millions of volts slashed the earth.
That was the worst storm we've had since I was knee-high to a duck.
Folks talked about it and started getting things back to normal. When Mick hit town for his vacation.
Well, it's straight ahead about 5 miles.
But things weren't normal. There were changes.
Mother bit me. I never saw him bite like that.
Strange, frightful changes. That night, it all started.
Stop doing that.
I'm not doing anything.
This was the night of the crawling terror. American International presents Squirm.
Squirm is far from brilliant. It is like getting a peek inside the head of a 13-year-old boy, smoking weed for the first time and thinking, without any evidence, that no really, all you have to do to get the worms to come up out of the ground and attack us is a little bit of lightning. It's a silly little film, but even that movie shows that there was an appetite for mutant horror that was a bit smaller and closer to home. The same year as Jaws gave us another little movie called Bug, featuring William Castle of House on Haunted Hill fame in his last role.
It was a day like any other. The air hung heavy with the heat. Then it happened. A crack in the land that reached to the very bowels of the earth itself, spitting out the fires of hell.
And this is about some mutant fire-starting cockroaches that crawl up out of the earth after a massive earthquake. This one's another one of those tricky ones, though, because what starts as a fairly interesting natural horror film eventually morphs into some sort of mad scientist movie where the main character decides to capture and study them. He successfully breeds the underground roaches with some conventional roaches, because of course he does, and this gives them the ability to fly.
One man was determined to learn its secrets, to discover how it grew and what it needed to survive.
The Parmiteras will eat only raw meat, any kind.
At first, it ate only ashes, but now it needed meat, and it would get that meat from whatever source it could.
There's a strong sense towards the end that things have just been made all the worse by this mutation. Along the way to the eco-horror heavyweight champions of this genre, we got a little bit closer to the cautionary tales that characterized the decade. Food of the Gods was another dud in the same vein as Night of the Lepus. It was based on a small part in H.G. Wells' novel of the same name, and it also features real-life animals, rats in this case, filmed to appear gigantic.
More frightening than his War of the Worlds. More imaginative than his Time Machine. Now, H.G. Wells' masterpiece of science fiction, The Food of the Gods. The terrifying tale of man fighting for his life against an ecology gone berserk. This is the last chance for an unsuspecting world against harmless animals and insects made huge and vicious by the food of the gods.
Again, it's dated and lacks any memorable characters or story, but it is worth it to see just for the bizarre experience of seeing large rats on screen. Seriously, as silly as Food of the Gods and Night of the Lepus are, it's really cool seeing gigantism depicted with live animals using camera tricks and stuff. I could watch that stuff all night long. Then there's another literature-inspired film from 1977, Damnation Alley, a dystopian post-apocalyptic story about an Earth in which hurricane force winds high up in the sky prevent air travel and the land is full of giant mutant creatures.
Damnation Alley. Everything man remembers is gone. Everything he has achieved is forgotten. Every place he has lived has become a wasteland, desolate, barren. And these 5 survivors may be the only humans left alive. Together, they will attempt a journey into the unknown.
It is the aftermath of nuclear winter, but it too is a bit dated. All these efforts were like shots in the dark, though. They were valiant efforts to explore mutation horror in ways that are truly meaningful to people and not just mere spectacle. Even though some of them were, you might say, misfires, they deserve consideration for what they attempted to do. I applaud them for thinking a bit outside the box. I tell you, if I had seen Night of the Lepus when I was 6 years old, I might never want to be around a rabbit ever again in my life. But as for films that terrify adults who know better than to fear oversized rodents, we might think twice about the threat if it was a bit more realistic. One of the first films to move in that direction was a film that was criticized unfairly, in my opinion, for being a Jaws ripoff, but which has gained something of a following in recent years, and that's Piranha.
Who could have imagined they were there? Who could have predicted they would attack? And now, who would survive? Piranha, they're here.
No! You bitch! Stay back!
Piranha, they're hungry.
Piranha was a film that, while certainly feeding into the more exploitation tendencies of the genre, was still mature enough to have a point. The idea of a government not only able to create a species of fish capable of ravishing the ecology and inhabitants of Vietnam, but willing to create them, is in and of itself pretty profound. But then there was the now typical and almost obligatory plotline of a greedy tourist town unwilling to heed the warnings of those who know best. Piranha may have been doomed to living under the shadow of Jaws, but it had quite a lot of talent behind it. Director Joe Dante now has developed a reputation as a horror legend after going on to helm other classics like The Howling, The Burbs, and of course, Gremlins. Writer John Sayles is often given praise for his witty script and clever dialogue, making Piranha far more watchable than your typical B-movie. Yet still, having been produced by Roger Corman, the famed indie producer known for turning out cheap movies quickly, Universal Studios was prepared to sue him for having made a film that bore such a close resemblance to Jaws, and the one thing that held him back was Spielberg, who claimed that Piranha was the best of all the Jaws ripoffs. Perhaps it was his praise that rescued the film from obscurity. It also led to an even more ridiculous sequel, directed by none other than James Cameron in his directing debut. And yes, the guy that gave us Terminator and Titanic started his career with a film about flying piranha. I could see why he was in the closet about that one for many years, but the film has developed a cult following. It also saw a reboot with Piranha 3D, which I sadly missed when it was in the theater. There are not many horror movies that I think lend themselves to 3D, but any underwater creature features are just begging for it. If you ask me, the next one needs to be Orca 3D. There's no way that's not going to be the best movie of the year. Tell me I'm wrong. Getting back to Piranha, though, if that film is elevated by its witty script, I have to say that screenwriter John Sayles wrote an arguably better film 2 years after Piranha. It's actually so good that it should certainly go into any Hall of Fame for natural horror. Hell, maybe even horror period. And I'm talking about Alligator.
It lives 50 feet beneath the streets. It's 36 feet long. It weighs over 2,000 pounds. And it's about to break out.
This film is so cleverly written from start to finish, and the execution is stellar, thanks to relative newcomer Louis Teague, who likely learned a few things about filming animals which would come in handy for his later films, Cujo and Cat's Eye. From the very beginning of Alligator, the metaphor of a suburban family flushing its problems down the toilet is quite conspicuous. All those families that discarded their pet carcasses covertly were unknowingly feeding a monster, and for 12 years that baby alligator grew to an enormous size and lived under the streets of Chicago in the sewers. The whole concept is basically taken from urban legend of a similar thing having happened beneath major cities like Chicago. But the pets that this alligator were feeding off of were themselves the products of experiments with growth hormones in an effort to improve livestock and breeding yields in agriculture. It does this by increasing the animal's metabolism and by extension its appetite. Sounds like they really thought of everything a horror movie needs, huh? What elevates this from B-movie status, though, is the very clear and brilliant statement about who is really harmed in a scenario like this. The alligator first picks off some lowly blue-collar workers, then some cops, then a middle-class family's child. Then eventually it makes its way all the way up the socioeconomic ladder and attacks the hoity-toity during a wedding. Seriously though, that wedding scene. We get a big fat alligator having a field day with everyone, and it's great in so many ways. It's great as a bloodbath, it's great as catharsis. The scene is probably one of the most satisfying scenes in all of horror history, and totally worth the price of admission. By this point, you might even forget that you're watching a serious deconstruction of urban class structure, because who doesn't like a good bloodbath? And this is where a story about a mutated creature can really become elevated to the status of a serious horror film. I mean, Alligator doesn't feel serious when you're watching it, but it's very sharp and has just as much to say as a movie like Jaws. But it isn't the best film in this category, though. That would be a film that came out just 1 year prior in 1979, and it has one of the most disturbing scenes in horror history in it. It cuts right to the heart of what truly frightens us about mutations in general, and that is the thought that our own offspring might become deformed, and that it might be because of something we did. I'm talking about John Frankenheimer's monster classic, Prophecy.
It is not the offspring of witchcraft or Satan. It was created by man. It will grow to be 15 feet tall. It will have huge eyes, webbed hands, hooked claws. It will walk upright. And it will mindlessly, mercilessly kill every living thing it meets. Prophecy.
This film has not been given a fair day in court, and while I'm not going to say it's without its problems, I'll get to those in a minute, this film should have been a horror masterpiece, right up there with The Exorcist. What we got fell short of what Frankenheimer was trying to deliver, and he even admitted later that this was due to his alcoholism. Well, the film he did give us is still, warts and all, very close to what I'm calling the best attempt anyways to take mutation horror to its logical endpoint. The film starts with Dr. Robert Verne, an EPA worker getting sent to do what he believes is a routine environmental inspection, and what he finds is a very violent clashing between local natives and a logging company that stands accused of harming the ecology. There's even this long drawn-out scene where the scientist is made to choose whether he's going to support the natives or not. The scientist seems objective enough, though, and we're led to believe that the natives are just superstitious, especially when they talk about a prophecy about some entity they call the Katadin. Whether or not such a creature exists is beside the point for Dr. Verne, who's just there to do his job. He discovers that several species have mutated, including a salmon that is large enough to devour a duck. He eventually discovers that the logging company is in fact using mercury in its operations. It used to be used back in the day by logging companies as an antifungal agent, but was banned because it causes birth defects in living organisms. And therein lies the terrifying truth about mutations. They're an unfortunate reality. Certain chemicals and substances cause reproductive harm. That is a fact. The movie ups the stakes when Dr. Verne's wife, who is with him, and unbeknownst to him, very much pregnant, realizes that her baby might now be in danger of deformity because she ate some of the local fish. Rather than just make this a subplot, there's a moment where everything that's going on to everyone in the film happens all at once. This is when the baby cub of the 15-foot tall mutated bear that's been ravaging the forest is found, screeching like a wounded pig. They try to save its life, but the animal is so deformed that all anyone can do is just watch it suffer. Then, with the poor thing crying out in the background, the doctor's wife has a look of terror that says everything. The doctor's confused. He doesn't understand why she's so emotional, and that's because he doesn't know that she's pregnant. It's a truly brutal and disturbing scene. And it's the sort of moment that could only happen in a horror movie. Never mind the huge bear monster or the political white noise. In this scene, the film makes mutation horror more personal than it ever usually gets. Prophecy was another casualty of comparisons. Critics picked it apart for its poor special effects, its slow pacing, its two-dimensional characters, and its trite messaging. And to be fair, some of those are fair points. But it too was too often called a poor man's Alien and things like that it makes me wonder how little has changed in the horror genre. For a serious horror movie to receive the respect of The Exorcist or Silence of the Lambs, it had better be perfect. Critics are always waiting to pick apart any horror movie that dares have something to say. And I'll admit that, even by eco-horror standards, this film is very preachy. But for all its faults, it does things that few films of that time tried to do. It made nature's horrors very personal. It's not like this film was meant to be some throwaway B-movie. Sometimes I feel like critics are kinder to films that were never trying to be anything original or sophisticated, but the moment a filmmaker tries to make another Exorcist, they swarm like vultures to pick it apart. I mean, Frankenheimer was not a nobody. He'd already made films like The Manchurian Candidate, as well as Bloody Sunday just 2 years prior. It's clear that he might have made a masterpiece, but even what he did make was a film worth checking out. Nowadays, mutations in horror seldom rise above the typical schlock of making something bigger and more deadly for its own sake. Movies like Deep Blue Sea, Insecticidal, and of course Eight-Legged Freaks are about the extent to which mutations are now depicted in horror. Although, one more film that does break that mold a little bit is the Natalie Portman movie, Annihilation.
Can you describe its form?
No. It's beautiful. Check this out.
It's like they're stuck in a continuous mutation. Anything interesting in there?
No.
Sharks have teeth like that. It's not possible. You can't crossbreed different species.
What is it?
The soldiers on the last expedition.
They went crazy, or something in here killed them.
Something's come through the fence. Through the fence? It's destroying everything.
It's not destroying. It's making something new.
This one's not strictly speaking natural horror, because it does basically rely on aliens, but it does offer an interesting take on the very idea of mutations in horror, and it uses the imagery of nature. The film actually has more in common with Cronenberg than natural horror, though, because it kind of suggests that horror is a bit of a comfort. All of the characters in the film are damaged from some trauma, so the thought that a fragmented reality where nothing remains in its designed form is a fitting reflection of the mind of someone that has been through literal hell. When it's revealed that one of the characters is a soldier with PTSD, the point could not be clearer. The world we see on screen is merely reflecting the fragmented identity of a trauma victim. It's such an interesting way to comment on mutation, and why we might be so unnerved at its mere presence. The idea that things in their correct form are pleasing, and things that are deformed are not. And this is because we need that normalcy to feel sane. And the lack thereof spells doom for our very ability to move forward. It would be truly special if horror filmmakers interested in depicting mutations in natural horror films actually sit and think about the serious potential they have. Why do mutations bother us so much? I mean, they don't always bother us, but those stories tend to become superhero-type movies. And there's nothing wrong with those, but whenever there's something that truly gets under our skin, it will surely be up to horror movies to explain it. And with growing technologies and things like life extension, fetal viability outside the womb, body modification, and countless others, I'll be anxiously awaiting the next horror film that tells us what to make of it. And if those filmmakers would be so kind, I hope it has a whale in it. Well, there you go. That wasn't so bad, was it? A somewhat measured look at mutation horror with a little bit of wiggle room to include all your favorites. Well, if this one was tricky to pin down, discovery horror will be even harder. I regret to inform you, dear listener, that I may or may not have been distracted last week by a certain election going on. I actually technically ran for office this year, and all of my friends wanted a piece of my time last week, and for that I apologize. We will be back with episode 4. Again, if you'd like to send us any comments, suggestions, or derogatory remarks, email us at anatomyoffearpodcast@gmail.com. There is a list of natural horror films to check out on our blog, anatomyoffear.com. If you want to participate in Natural Horror November with us, use the hashtag Natural Horror November if you post a review so we can check it out. I hope you guys keep having an awesome November. Till next time, be safe.